Well, thank you everyone for joining us on River Rising Solutions webcast. I'm Shannon Blankenship, Advocacy Director at St. John's Riverkeeper, and I'm joined by my co-host, Jimmy Orth, Executive Director. Tonight on episode 4 of the River Rising Solutions webcast, we want to better understand the green versus gray approach to infrastructure and find out more about what the City of Atlanta has done to lead the way in water quality improvements and flood reduction. Tonight, we're going to be joined by Corey Rayburn, Watershed Manager with the City of Atlanta Department of Watershed Management. And tonight, we're going to discuss what is gray versus green infrastructure. And then we'll then have our guest speaker join us to find out how the City of Atlanta is leading the way in applying green infrastructure standards to stormwater management. And then we'll end with questions and viewer comments. So to begin, Jimmy, would you mind telling people about St. John's Riverkeeper and this web series, how it helps us to fulfill our mission?
Yeah, absolutely. And I know a lot of you have probably heard our spiel before or have watched some of our other episodes of this River Rising series. But I do want to say that we are a nonprofit advocacy group for the St. John's River. Some people refer to us as a watchdog group for the river. So what our role is really to make sure that regulatory agencies are held accountable. People, different businesses that are polluting the river are being held accountable. Our laws are being implemented and enforced. And that our citizenry is engaged, because our river really has to have an engaged constituency for the St. John's River if we're going to be successful in cleaning it up. So we do a lot with education, outreach, volunteers, and empowering people to get involved and take action for their river. So there's a lot of ways to do that. And I would encourage you to go visit our website at stjohnsriverkeeper.org. You can find a lot of information, not only about the issues we're working on, but also a lot of our programs and how you can get plugged into the work that we're doing. This series, River Rising, it really came, it was born out of, one, when we've been involved, obviously, for, gosh, it's been a long time now, trying to ensure that the dredging of the St. John's River is going to, one, it's not going to cause significant harm to the St. John's, but also that it's mitigated properly. And one of the concerns that we've had all along is that when you dig a deeper channel, it can actually increase storm surge and it can increase the risk of flooding. And we saw that during Hurricane Irma, how vulnerable the city of Jacksonville and many other cities throughout Florida are to flooding. When Irma came through in 2017, it was only a category, it was actually a tropical storm, and it caused Category 3 flooding in Jacksonville. And we really realized that inches do matter. So the inches that an increase in storm surge that are going to be brought about by dredging, we saw how important those few inches could be to the future of Jacksonville and to resiliency. And of course, it has a big impact on the river. That's the biggest concern for us. We obviously are concerned about people's homes and private property, but we're also concerned about the health of the river. And when we have excessive flooding, it can cause a lot of problems with more pollution, essentially flows into the river. And so it's a health hazard. It causes more sewer overflows, which can cause raw sewage to flow into the St. John's. So there's a lot of problems when we have that are associated with rising waters and with sea level rise. So we really started this series to raise awareness around the impacts of not only dredging, but also sea level rise and climate change. And so now we're working on this series to really educate solutions. How do we prepare and become more resilient as communities, but also at the same time, the impacts and the causes of climate change?
Jimmy, you know, of all the topics that we've covered so far through this webcast, I think this topic that we're going to talk about today is the most timely for the counties that are currently working on resiliency strategies within the watershed, because every city is looking at the necessary improvements that are needed to address rising waters and ongoing flooding. And most cities typically have gone with gray infrastructure in the past, gray infrastructure like bulkheads and seawalls and culverts, storm drains, roads, sidewalks. All of these approaches are looking to move water as quickly as possible during a rain event from the paved impervious surfaces to storm drains, culverts, pipes, retention ponds, and then a lot of times directly into the waterways. So what we're seeing now is that storms, with them being more intense and more frequent, our current infrastructure wasn't built to accommodate the additional level of precipitation that we're seeing. And second, we're seeing that at the end of the pipe, our waterways are rising, and you can't discharge a pipe into water that's flowing into your storm system. So that being said, as our cities are looking to upgrade infrastructure, many are just rethinking traditional gray options. And instead, municipalities are looking to install green infrastructure that can capture water, treat rainfall, and use some of these nature-based solutions. Jimmy, I know you've been an advocate for green infrastructure or nature-based infrastructure in Florida, and specifically in the city of Jacksonville for decades now. So before we jump to our guest speaker, can you just walk us through a few of the gray versus green kind of dynamics and help us to understand why St. John's Riverkeeper as an organization has decided to really wants to see more of these solutions incorporated into future infrastructure projects?
Yeah, well, a good example is, with this, for instance, is when we see flooding, particularly in older neighborhoods, like I live in an older historic neighborhood, and those storm drains, the water flows into, it goes straight to the St. Johns River. There is no treatment along the way. So there's really opportunities to retrofit areas where you can use these, like for instance, this curb cut out here where water would flow into this bioswale and would be retained by the soils, by the plants, and actually be filtered before it's released into the soil or overflows into the storm drain. And so it gives it the opportunity to treat the stormwater that can pick up so many pollutants along the way. And then here we have a living shoreline and then a bulkhead on the other side. The living shoreline is really a filter. It helps to filter the runoff before it makes it to the St. John's, and filters out those pollutants from fertilizers. I mean, you can obviously see they probably fertilize the grass. And on the right, it's, the bulkhead, it's probably not going to be filtered along the way. Same thing in the cities, all that runoff that runs off of the sidewalks and off the streets, it's going to go into the storm drain. In downtown Jacksonville, it's going straight into the St. John's untreated. And so here's an opportunity to retrofit streets, sidewalks, and to treat that water before it makes it to the waterway. And we're talking about not just during major storm events, it's talking about, just regular rainfall events. And then here's a bioswale that we actually, St. John's Riverkeeper, initiated years ago in Jacksonville. It was actually the first bioswale on a publicly owned property in Jacksonville in the right-of-way in the San Marco neighborhood in Jacksonville. We were hoping this would be a catalyst for more green infrastructure in Jacksonville. It really hasn't happened to this point. But we're optimistic that the timing is right now, that communities are looking for new solutions. And I think the other point too is that traditionally we filter this, or we divert this stormwater into retention ponds where it's feasible to build these large retention ponds. And they haven't worked very effectively. They're supposed to remove about 80% of the pollutants that are polluting at the receiving body. And they work at a lot of times I've seen studies, 30 to 40% of the pollutants are being reduced. So we really have to figure out a way to have a treatment train where we're actually treating the water along the way and not just relying solely on retention ponds, but that we can use nature-based solutions to help us achieve those goals. And I have to say too that Corey, he came to town not too long ago, before you introduce him, and he was speaking to the USGBC group, the U.S. Green Building Council, and I saw that he was coming to town, and so I was so excited, and I asked if he would come and speak to our environmental quality division here in Jacksonville and try to educate them, frankly, on the benefits and how Atlanta has been implementing these practices successfully. We're still waiting to see if that's going to bear fruit, Corey, but I'm optimistic maybe that we're going to start picking up getting some momentum now.
Well, that's a good segue. I want to bring our guest into the discussion now because the city of Atlanta knows this topic really well. Corey Rayburn is the watershed manager for the city of Atlanta's Office of Water Protection, and he heads up the environmental management division. Corey played a lead role in adopting and implementing Atlanta's green infrastructure standards for stormwater management on private development, and he currently oversees the installation of regional green infrastructure projects throughout the city. So Corey, to jump over to you, give us some background. Why is it that Atlanta is a leader in innovative projects and investments into stormwater infrastructure?
So thanks, Shannon and Jimmy, for that introduction and the setup for this discussion. I think it's going to be valuable regardless of what city you're in. Every city is a little bit different. The city of Atlanta has a combined sewer in the urban core of Atlanta, just the urban downtown part, that has caused us problems over the years. And one of the real drivers for change was we got sued back in the 90s by our local riverkeeper based on our combined sewage issues. Every time it rained, you would have sewage dumping into the Chattahoochee River. And so at that time, the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, jumped on board that lawsuit, and Atlanta came out with one of the first consent decrees to really address our combined sewer system, our infrastructure, and our problems that we saw. And when you do have a combined sewer system, during these big rains, 95% of the flow in the pipes is stormwater. So it's really ultimately a stormwater issue is what causes challenges to these systems. And so we managed the solutions. We've addressed most of the consent decree requirements using gray infrastructure, using tunnels, using large vaults, pipes. And about halfway through, we really kind of at a staff level learned of some of the great benefits of using an integrated green infrastructure, gray infrastructure approach. And so whereas Atlanta is not like Philadelphia or New York, where they both convinced EPA to allow them to meet their consent decree requirements using green infrastructure, we are still on the old kind of format with it. But we've started at a staff level integrating green approaches into our capital projects to meet our consent decree requirements. And so it's more of a voluntary basis versus, the feds or the state kind of making us do anything. That coupled, and we'll see some videos of some of our bigger capital projects where we've integrated green into some of the solutions. But really that coupled with our ordinance that makes private developers and builders integrate green infrastructure into their job site. We essentially said, if you're doing anything in Atlanta, whether it's tearing down a house and building a new house, whether it's putting a gas station, whether it's putting a strip mall up, you have to incorporate green infrastructure into your site plan. And we made it fairly stringent to where there's not a lot of wiggle room out of those requirements. Nobody was really making us do this. Typically with environmental regulations, the federal government or the state EPD will come to us and say, hey, you have to adopt this by a certain date or else, but this approach was really generated at the staff level because we saw the benefit in an integrated green infrastructure approach. So leveraging all the development that was going on in Atlanta and requiring builders and developers to use these types of practices on their sites is really where we've gotten the bulk of the volume control that we've seen over the past 8 years. And so that really, I guess, set us apart. And we proved in Atlanta that it's doable, that we weren't going to drive development out to the suburbs, which was one of the big fears when we originally brought this up, is that the more environmental regulations you have, the less development is going to occur and less redevelopment, which of course the politicians and a lot of folks want to see some of our older parts of town, redeveloped. And so that in itself proved to a lot of people, once people started seeing it in the ground, started seeing rain gardens, started seeing the aesthetic side of green infrastructure, permeable pavement, they were like, okay, yeah, this is something we can go along with. And it's just kind of gotten more and more popular over the years once the private development folks kind of jumped on board. And so that in itself is really what kind of sets the city apart. We were one of the first bigger cities in the Southeast to really adopt this approach and mandate it. And since then, our MS4 permits were just renewed this past year, and that's the state level stormwater permits. I'm sure you have something similar in Florida and Jacksonville. But it's essentially said all middle and large cities, all medium and large size cities have to adopt the green infrastructure standard by the end of this year. So it took us about 8 years to prove that it's viable. And since then, the state has jumped on board and said, all right, every city across the state of Georgia now has to implement these green infrastructure standards on new and redevelopment projects. So for us, that was a big win. And it showed the viability of this type of approach, not just in our own capital projects, but on the private development side as well.
Yeah, and I commend you, Corey, because I know it's not easy to convince developers to do something new. And also, too, that when you guys started really adopting this, there was still a lot of questions, and it wasn't, even now, the research is not as extensive as it is on some of the older, gray infrastructure solutions, obviously. So you were taking a little bit of a leap of faith, I would imagine.
We did, and I mean, we in general, because of that, because we knew it was a new requirement, we knew we were going to get pushback from the development community. We spent about a year of just doing outreach to stakeholders, engineering groups, developers, builders, real estate management groups, anybody that wanted to talk about it. We came to them and said, listen, this is what we're proposing. It's not the end of the world. And one of the main development groups at the time came out against it. And we sat down before we went to our council and said, these are the benefits, what questions do you have? Let us have a dialogue. We went back and forth, and we kind of adjusted things a little bit based on their feedback. And in the end, they got in front of our council and said, we don't support it, but we're not going to fight it. And so that was good enough for us. And since then, I've gone back to their monthly meetings and just shown them a bunch of pretty pictures of permeable pavement and rain gardens and bar retention. And they actually took pride in it. They were like, we helped do that. We helped to incorporate that into the standards. And so a lot of times it's all about taking the necessary time, reaching across the table, trying to find ways in which you can kind of meet in the middle on certain things and feel like the other side got a win out of it. But in the end, we were pushing pretty hard to adopt these standards, and we're ultimately successful with it.
Corey, I think this is a good segue to show some of the projects that Atlanta has done. If you want, I can either go through some of the images that you shared or the video that you sent that I think does a good job of discussing some of the. Okay.
The video is fine. That's great.
All right. Oh, I hope there's sound. Do you guys have sound?
I'm not hearing.
Don't. Darn it.
To our water sewer fee. It reduces the likelihood of water sewer rate increases. It also provides jobs. In 2016, council approved for 10% of the most to be used for stormwater projects. Atlanta does not have a funded stormwater program. So this was really big. And so it's allowed us over the past few years to start finding solutions to repair our aging stormwater system. The example is Dean Russ Park Pond. We were able to take a pond that was not functioning properly, that was loaded with trash. We've actually cleaned it out, put in new systems to collect the trash, as well as making the first smart pond for the city of Atlanta. It allows us to actually repair the pond and make it more efficient using a smart system that monitors the weather, and right before storm events will lower the level of the pond so that it holds more storm water, reducing flooding in the area. Every time that we implement green infrastructure, it actually allows us to do more than just pipes at the ground. And it's something that's visible to the public that they can enjoy. Hemlock Circle, that was a project where there was a large intersection that had a lot of pavement. There was a lot of flooding. The residents were complaining, and they came to us, and we worked with them. It was a collaborative process to work out a solution that would work in their neighborhood, and it was putting a bioretention system in to create a nice little rain garden for the residents, and it provides a flooding solution also. Rodney Cook Park is another great example of most funding. During rain events, it stores rainwater and slowly releases it. So when it's complete, it will provide a 150-acre basin of stormwater in the area that diverts all that stormwater to the pond and can hold up to 10 million gallons of stormwater. That's close to a 100-year storm event. The most also is not a new tax. This is a tax that we have been doing since 2004 and has been renewed every 4 years. And we're just hoping that we're able to continue that process so that we can continue to provide the services that we do to our customers.
I was waiting to see if the sound was going to totally end. I like that video. I think it gave us a good visual of some of the projects in Atlanta. Is there anything you want to walk through that was covered in that?
Sure. So the most tax that Todd, that's my boss, Todd Hill, was discussing is a way for us to fund some of our stormwater management projects. It did get passed a couple months ago or during our primary votes, and so we do have 4 more years of funding. But the problem is it's not a dedicated funding source. I mean, without a stormwater utility fee, it's hard to do long-term planning and budgeting to really tackle some of these problems, because the problems that, Jimmy mentioned, these historic neighborhoods have historic drainage issues, and the more and more development that occurs around the city, you just exacerbate it. And so you have to be creative with your solutions, and there's not a lot of public property in some of these areas. And so, funding is essential to having a long-term approach and a long-term solution to some of these challenges. But the most tax, it does generate a good bit of money. It provides about $10 to $12 million just in stormwater funding per year. But with the COVID stuff going on, we've been projecting some shortfalls, and so that might get adjusted here in the next year or so. But generally speaking, that is one of the ways in which we fund some of these stormwater projects. The projects that are inside the combined sewer system, we're able to justify, using ratepayer money to install some of these larger capital projects, like you saw Rodney Cook Senior Park, that 9 million gallon pond. It's one of those kind of gray-green hybrid approaches. Some people don't think a pond is necessarily green infrastructure. But in my background, you see historic Fourth Ward Park, which was one of our first kind of quasi-green infrastructure type projects in Atlanta. And it saved the city. The gray approach was to install another tunnel system to take pressure off the system. It would have cost about $40 million. This more green solution cost the city about $25 million. We partnered with a nonprofit group and the Beltline to actually deliver the project. And it's essentially recreating a wetlands littoral ecosystem in a part of Atlanta where all the streams had been piped for 100 years. I mean, this area was plagued with flooding. There was a good bit of contamination in that area. And so this reintroduced nature to a part of town that had just been kind of in squalor and was just needing a little bit of spark in that area to really spur some economic growth. And since that project went in and it was installed in 2010, 2011, there's been over $500 million of private redevelopment that's occurred in and around that area. So that comes with its own challenges with gentrification and a quick rise and kind of in economic activity in any given area. So that's one of the challenges that we are still facing, and I don't think anybody has a real solution to. But all in all, a project that saved the city $15 million ended up generating a ton of economic growth. And it's not all from that one project. I mean, the Beltline, which is a popular path, is right next to it. So the Beltline has been bringing a lot of regrowth and economic growth in and around the city. But a lot of people want to be near water, and it provides really that community benefit. I mean, this park is just jam-packed with folks year-round using it, wanting to walk by the waterfalls and wanting to see, these flood management types of practices. And so, that's why the city really has bought in wholeheartedly, is the other benefits, the social benefits, the environmental benefits, and as well as the potential for economic benefits, the triple bottom lines is what we call it, that comes with green infrastructure that you don't really necessarily see with the gray approach. And these pictures are just some small scale rain gardens. These are just retrofit projects. I manage one of our annual contracts where we just go and find flooding problems or areas that in parks generally that we can install these small little practices next to parking lots or in areas that we know flood. Just again, take some of the pressure off of the system.
We need that. We need to do that. We need just some small projects that take the pressure off the system. So, I mean, these are just such great examples of, things that honestly, I feel like if we had them in Jacksonville, people probably wouldn't even notice them. But, but Atlanta, and that's why I just think you guys are doing such a good job of, honestly installing very visible, aesthetically beautiful projects, but in a way invisible. It's still infrastructure, like an underground pipe, except, just again, those co-benefits of these projects are so enormous. And so it's so great to just stroll through these images and see what, other cities could be doing.
One of the questions I have real quick, Corey, is, when we were installing the bioswale that we showed a picture of earlier, one of the challenges we had, frankly, is we had money from a grant. So it wasn't costing the city any money to install the bioswale. Where we got pushback from the city was they were really concerned that it was going to add to their maintenance costs. And so there's not this, this effort across different departments to say, okay, we understand your concerns. We understand this may take a little more maintenance, but looking at, the whole cost and the cost benefit of the entire project and how it benefits the city as a whole is lacking, obviously, here in Jacksonville, because, we tried to talk about all the benefits and they didn't care. All they cared was square foot cost to maintain. And so I think
Sure.
That's one of the challenges. Did y'all have an issue with that, like with your maintenance department taking issue with some of these projects, or was that addressed on the front end?
Absolutely. I mean, that is a challenge with all infrastructure, and sometimes with the gray infrastructure, the fact that we've ignored maintenance for so long, because it's out of sight, out of mind, because it's underground, it still has to be maintained, but you're not necessarily seeing the issue until there's a big rain and it floods, and then they go and maintain it. So there's really challenges, I think, across the board with all infrastructure with maintenance. However, with green infrastructure, if it's not maintained, you see it, and you see it really quickly. I mean, these things are in a flow path, and so they collect trash and they collect weed seeds. And so with a lot of these bioswales, I manage the contract for maintenance, which is, it's easy. So, I mean, one of the cases we make is we'll take care of it. and almost you need to have that champion and a local government that understands the challenges of all these types of different ways of managing stormwater and sets aside some funding every year to maintain these systems. There's been some examples across the country where cities like Portland, you know, some of the cities that have been installing these bioswales for 15 years now, where they've been approached by nonprofits or neighborhood groups to kind of adopt these bioswales. That's an opportunity, but they basically said it doesn't work in the long run. That you really have to the cities have to take ownership of these types of practices for them to be regularly maintained. During the growing season, I send a crew out to all of our planters, our right-of-way planters, every other week, because they do start sprouting weeds and they do collect trash, and that weed growth isn't going to affect the function as much, but it's part of the aesthetics, though. You want these things you want to give them a couple years to really root in, and the longer you give them, the more the better function it's going to provide. The bigger the plants are, the more runoff it's going to really attenuate and mitigate. And so during those first couple of years of growth, you really have to keep the weeds at bay. You really have to take care of your plants. And so because of that, there is a little bit more upfront maintenance cost associated with it. I think our asset managers in our cities are more used to dedicating maintenance on our older systems versus our newer systems. So it's a little bit of a reverse role. Once they do get filled in and healthier and a better stand of vegetation, there is less maintenance. But there's always going to be a need for trash removal, because again, these are front facing. Some of them are in the right of way, some of them are in public parks. And generally speaking, if you want people to be happy about this approach, you need to keep up with it. And so that's a big part of it, is dedicating that funding towards maintenance costs.
Corey, speaking of that, can you talk more about some of the leadership that's behind Atlanta's green infrastructure programs? You know, where are the decisions being made, and then who's implementing it? Because I know that, you know, it can be very diverse among different departments when it comes to, again, the co-benefits of green infrastructure projects.
Absolutely. And so in the city, our watershed department has been one of the drivers for this kind of shift in thought. But really, we started these efforts back, you know, in early 2010, 2011. And at the time, there was a lot of interest from outside organizations, nonprofits, American Rivers, the Conservation Fund, Park Pride, some of our local nonprofit organizations that have helped us over the years. We formed a task force, a green infrastructure task force, that was comprised of all those kind of nonprofit organizations. But we also invited every one of our departments to the table. The folks that hadn't kind of drank the Kool-Aid and that still had a lot of questions. We had regular meetings, and we brought these nonprofits to the table. And really what having a kind of joint approach really helps is with, you know, keeping the city honest. Really, it's having those outside voices, not only kind of holds our feet to the fire, but also essentially they provide free consulting for us. I mean, they have resources that are through foundations and then through different efforts that they basically provide us with consulting that we wouldn't have otherwise on some of these more innovative approaches. You know, a lot of these folks do work throughout the country. And so just sharing ideas, you know, that other folks are doing. It's not a one size fits all approach, but that task force was actually formed after we went and visited the city of Philadelphia and saw some of the programs that they were doing. And it was organized by a local nonprofit, the Conservation Fund. They set everything up. They lined up the speakers. We went up there for 2 or 3 days. We enjoyed ourselves. You know, we talked with our different departments and strategized. And when we came home, we realized that, you know, even though Philadelphia had this as part of their consent decree and they had $100 million to spend on it, we had the same challenges that they do. You know, their public works department mows down their rain gardens the same way ours does, you know. And so
good to hear that we're all sharing in our issues from the mowing and maintenance division. Yeah,
absolutely. but we were able to bring that, I guess, momentum back, and we formed this task force. And it really helped provide that kind of ongoing momentum through the hard times, because, you know, we can talk to we're blue in the face, but our public works department, who is ultimately responsible for the roads and the right of ways, they always have pushback. There's always concern. You know, anytime you put anything in the roadway, there's going to be some, because it's different, there's going to be a lot of questions, a lot of maintenance issues. And so kind of tackling those, there's no one workshop, there's no one meeting. It has to be kind of an ongoing approach to really integrate this into the thought process of any city.
I'm hoping you can, you know, you've been with the city now for 10 years. Do you have a project in particular that you're really proud of that you want to tell us about? Because I know that Atlanta has so many different things going on, but is there anything that sort of stands out to you that that you feel like we should learn from?
The Cook Park project that Todd mentioned, that was still under construction, that's been my baby for about 5 years now. It's taken a lot of work. But one really cool thing about that project is we're solving flooding problems. We're using green infrastructure. It's kind of, again, a hybrid approach where there is going to be a big pond, but there's going to be a wetland in the middle of it. I mean, this is, again, an area of the combined sewer where there's no creeks nearby. And one of the coolest parts about it is we've partnered with the Trust for Public Land to deliver the project. So it's, in a way, it's a public-private partnership. We are, at the city, are managing the flood management part of it. But we've been working with the Trust for Public Land, who is delivering the park side of it. So 5 years ago, our engineers, our landscape architects got together with theirs and figured out a way to where this pond is going to be the centerpiece of this overall park development. And it was through fundraising, through, you know, the Woodruff Center, Coca-Cola, Delta, Arthur Blank, you know, the nonprofit is able to tap into some of those resources, and they brought it to this project. And it's just been a great effort that shows what cities can do when they partner with local organizations that want to see improvement in some certain parts of town. The part of town that we're talking about, it's where Martin Luther King had his adult home. I mean, when he passed away, that's where his family was living, just a block away from that Cook Park project. And since then, since the 70s, it's just taken a kind of a downward turn. There's lots of vacancy, lots of crime. And when you ask the community what some of the issues are, you know, every other answer is flooding. That you can't live comfortably in an older neighborhood when you have to fear every time it rains, you're going to have to be rescued from your home, which is what happened back in 2002 in this area. And so I think that is a great just example of the city partnering with other organizations to get projects completed. It's always a little bit harder. You know, again, you ask our engineers what the solution is, they'll tell you a big tunnel. But when you have green space, when you have trees, when you have specialized soils, it's always a little bit more difficult on the planning side and the construction side. And that's why it helps to have some partner agencies to help the city along with some of these approaches. That's a big one right there. And I'll be really happy when it's done, hopefully in September of this year. It's taken a lot longer than we thought. There was some contamination that we didn't know about that slowed things down. But in the end, it's going to be a really great project. One of the other pictures that you showed was this paver streets. That was an approach using gray and green infrastructure to resolve flooding in Southeast Atlanta. And that resulted in one of the biggest kind of roadway retrofit projects in the country, really anywhere that we've seen, using permeable pavement as a means of managing some of these floodwaters and getting some of that water back into the ground, slowing it down, cleaning it before it gets into the combined sewer system. That's
great. Well, that's the thing too that's so wonderful about these projects, when you you can combine the benefits of a park and green infrastructure. That's the thing, like in Jacksonville in particular, and I know it's this way throughout the Southeast, where you just are focused on retention ponds, where they literally, in a lot of cases, they want people to stay away from the retention pond. It's not really looked at as an amenity. And so to be able to combine flood control and stormwater treatment practices into and integrate it into a park and make it really a benefit and amenity for the community is great. That's what we found also in the bioswale we put in, is just how people loved it, because instead of it being a grass right away with a few trees in it, it actually became an amenity because of the aesthetics of it, but also at the same time, it was an education tool. And of course, it was treating water that was normally previously going straight into the St. John's untreated. So I love these co-benefits, and that's the thing that we've got to get people to understand too, is that the return on investment can be much greater if we look at the holistic value of these projects. I understand that you guys are also innovators in terms of funding, and have really done some really cool things with environmental impact bonds. I'm really excited. I learned about that not too long ago. You and other cities are using that effectively to fund projects. Tell us a little bit about that, because I think this is where the future is going to be in terms of how we're going to fund a lot of these projects.
Sure, absolutely. The environmental impact bond is a different approach. I mean, cities are pretty used to municipal bonds for capital projects, but this one was specifically to fund green infrastructure projects within a certain watershed. So a watershed that is an impaired stream. There's been a lot of focus in on this watershed by the feds, by the state, by local organizations. And so the environmental impact bond allows us to fund projects specifically for improvements in water quality and flooding in that watershed. It is different. It gets a little complicated pretty quick, but I'll try not to get too nerdy about it. But it is a pay for performance type of bond, which means that the investors who buy these bonds are taking a little bit of an upfront hit on the interest rates that they're getting back, knowing that it's going to fund environmental projects. Because these projects tend to be a little riskier, the EIBs are ways to leverage and manage that risk. So essentially, we set it up in a way that if these GI projects overperform, if we set a standard on stormwater volume that these things are going to capture, if they overperform, we essentially pay a performance payment. So those investors get a little bit more out of their investment than what they would have if the projects are just kind of meeting what we expect them to meet. So that's kind of a different approach than what most bonds are set up as. We were the first municipality to offer publicly offered environmental impact bonds. I think DC Water had done one, but it was on the private market. So, DC Water and us are kind of one of the first cities to really take this effort on. And hopefully we can show that it's a worthwhile way of funding some of these more innovative projects. We collected about $14 million from the sale of the bonds. We actually got a grant initially through the Rockefeller Foundation. The city of Atlanta was one of the 99th or 100th resilient cities, Rockefeller 100 resilient cities in the world. And that allowed us to get a grant for a couple of organizations, Neighborly and Quantified Ventures, to help us set up the bond. So we didn't get a grant just to fund projects. We got the grant to help structure the bond. And with their assistance, it took almost a year to get things organized and set up. But with their assistance, we were able to sell the bonds in a matter of days to fund these projects. We have till 2024 to actually deliver the projects. And so right now it's just in the design phase. We're about to bid out several of them, but it's anywhere from some stream restoration and floodplain restoration type projects. One of our creeks is in a concrete channel. So one of the projects is to tear out the concrete and restore the floodplain and to reconnect it to the reconnect the channel to the floodplain to naturally manage flooding in these areas, but to also improve water quality and improve habitat and the ecology in these areas. And so another one is to do stormwater planters like those bioswales in some of the urban neighborhoods. Another one is to create a huge wetlands that is, it kind of takes a small tributary and really spreads it out, and hopefully will attract a lot of ecosystem and get a lot of water quality benefits out of that. So it's projects that are, because they're outside of the combined sewer system, it's harder for us to fund using water and sewer dollars. And so this provides us a way to dedicate funded resources to these types of innovative projects.
That's exciting.
Hopefully, fingers are crossed, and you know, I think that if we make it work, we'll hopefully have it all structured to where we can do a phase 2 and to get more of these projects funded and built. But it is a challenge. I never knew how many attorneys were involved with bonds until we had a couple conference calls, and I saw 20 financiers and municipal attorneys that were on the call that were worried sick about this different way of doing it. But we managed to kind of get through some of those challenges, and the first time is always the hardest. And so we're really hopeful that this is going to be setting a positive precedence for the city and for others that want to do similar types of funding.
Well, Corey, you've shared a lot of inspirational ideas for us. I think any of the projects that you guys have going on, if St. John's Riverkeeper could take that momentum and make some of those projects happen within our watershed, we would be really, really proud. So I just want to thank you for sharing y'all's work with us to help inspire us. And Jimmy, do you have any final questions or comments for Corey before we end tonight's webcast?
No, I just want to thank you for doing it. I mean, I think this is the kind of thing we're hoping is that by showcasing the work that you and your colleagues are doing and others around the country, that hopefully it can be a catalyst for some change here in Jacksonville and throughout the watershed of the St. John's. So I appreciate y'all being a leader and taking those chances, because it's you that are the innovators and that set the stage for us to be able to learn from your mistakes, but also from your successes, and learn how to do it, how we can replicate that type of work here. So thank you so much, and thanks for being here with us tonight. I appreciate it.
Absolutely, yeah.
Our next episode will be on July 29th at 4 p.m. Episode 5 will focus on the state of solar in Florida. Our guest will be Angela DeMonbran of Solar United Neighbors, who's going to discuss the policies and the programs that currently operate to both promote and encourage, as well as detract from residential solar in Florida. So tune in and join us then. Again, thank you, Corey, for joining us tonight. And this will be online shortly. So check it out there. Check out some of our previous episodes, and everyone have a great night.
Thanks again, Corey.
Sure, no problem.